Gideon and the 300 men. The land of Israel was once again under great distress. The people had turned away from the Lord, and as a result, they suffered under the oppression of the Midianites. These enemies would come like a swarm of locusts with their camels and warriors, devouring the crops and leaving Israel impoverished. Fear filled the hearts of the Israelites, and many hid in caves and strongholds, waiting for relief that never seemed to come. In their desperation, the people cried out to God for deliverance. The Lord, in his mercy, listened to their prayers and began to raise up a deliverer, just as he had done in the days of old. That deliverer was Gideon, a man from the tribe of Manasseh, who at first saw himself as the least among his people. One day, Gideon was threshing wheat in a hidden winepress, trying to preserve food from the eyes of the Midianites. Suddenly, the angel of the Lord appeared to him and greeted him with words that seemed almost unbelievable. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon looked around, astonished, for he did not see himself as mighty. He questioned the angel, asking why, if the Lord was with them, all these calamities had come upon Israel. Where were the miracles of old, the acts of power that delivered their ancestors from Egypt? The angel of the Lord replied with authority that Gideon himself was being sent to save Israel from Midian. Shocked and uncertain, Gideon argued that his clan was the weakest in Manasseh and that he himself was the least in his father's house. But the Lord reassured him, saying, "I will be with you, and you will strike down the Midianites as if they were one man." To confirm this calling, Gideon asked for a sign. He prepared an offering of meat and unleavened bread, and placed it upon a rock as instructed. The angel of the Lord touched it with his staff, and fire rose from the rock, consuming the offering instantly. Then the angel vanished, and Gideon realized he had been in the presence of the divine messenger. Filled with awe and fear, he built an altar there and called it, "The Lord is Peace." That very night, God commanded Gideon to tear down his father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. In its place, he was to build an altar to the Lord and offer a bull as a sacrifice. Gideon obeyed, though he did it under the cover of darkness, for he feared his family and the men of the town. When the people discovered what had happened the next morning, they demanded Gideon's death. But his father, Joash, defended him, saying that if Baal were truly a god, he could defend himself. From that day on, Gideon was also called Jerubbaal, meaning, "Let Baal contend with him." Soon after, the Midianites and their allies gathered in the valley of Jezreel, ready to attack Israel once more. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew the trumpet, summoning the men of Israel to join him. Messengers were sent throughout Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and a great army assembled under his leadership. Still uncertain of his calling, Gideon asked God for another sign. He placed a fleece of wool on the ground and prayed that if God was truly going to save Israel through him, then in the morning the fleece would be wet with dew, while the ground around it remained dry. The next day it was so, but Gideon, still hesitant, asked for the opposite to happen the following night, that the fleece be dry while the ground was covered with dew. God graciously answered again, strengthening Gideon's faith. With confidence renewed, Gideon gathered his men, about 32,000 in total. But the Lord spoke to him, saying the army was too large. If Israel won with such numbers, they would boast that their own strength had saved them. God instructed Gideon to send home all those who were fearful. 22,000 departed, leaving only 10,000. Still, the Lord said the army was too many. He directed Gideon to bring them to the water. There the men who drank by lapping water with their tongues like dogs were separated from those who knelt and drank with their hands. Only 300 lapped the water in that unusual way, and God told Gideon that by these 300 he would deliver Israel. The rest were sent home. The task seemed impossible, 300 men against an enemy that filled the valley like locusts, with countless camels and warriors. But God had spoken, and his power was not limited by numbers. That night, the Lord told Gideon to go down to the enemy camp, for he had already given them into his hands. If he was still afraid, he could take his servant Purah and listen to what the enemy was saying. Gideon went quietly to the outskirts of the camp and overheard two Midianite soldiers speaking. One had a dream in which a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the Midianite camp, striking a tent with such force that it collapsed. The other interpreted the dream, declaring it could mean nothing other than the sword of Gideon, whom God had given victory over Midian. Upon hearing this, Gideon bowed in worship. Strengthened in faith, he returned to his camp and roused his 300 men. He divided them into 3 companies, giving each man a trumpet, an empty jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. There were no swords, no shields, only these simple instruments, for God himself would fight the battle. In the middle of the night, during the changing of the guard, Gideon and his men approached the outskirts of the Midianite camp. At his signal, they blew their trumpets, smashed their jars, and lifted their torches high, shouting, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" The noise and sudden lights created chaos and terror among the enemy. Believing they were surrounded by a vast army, the Midianites turned their swords against one another and fled in confusion. The Israelites pursued them, and reinforcements from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh joined in the chase. The enemy was routed, and Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim to cut off the Midianites at the Jordan River. The princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb were captured and executed, bringing further victory to Israel. The people rejoiced greatly, and peace began to return to the land. They wanted to make Gideon their king, but he refused, declaring, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you." Yet despite his humility, Gideon made an ephod from the gold collected as spoils of war, and unfortunately it became a snare to his family, for the people began to worship it. For the rest of Gideon's life, however, the land enjoyed peace. The story of the 300 men became a testimony of God's power and faithfulness, showing that victory comes not by human strength, but by trust in the Lord. The lesson of Gideon and his 300 men remains powerful across generations. God does not need great numbers or mighty weapons to accomplish his will. He seeks faith, obedience, and willingness to trust his word, even when circumstances seem impossible. Gideon's journey from fear and doubt to courage and victory reminds us that with God, even the smallest army can overcome the greatest of foes. When Israel saw what had been done, they could not deny that the Lord himself had delivered them. It was not Gideon's might, nor the strength of the 300, but the hand of God that had struck down Midian. And through this deliverance, the people were reminded once again of the power and mercy of their covenant-keeping God.